Welcome back to the Big Ideas That Matter podcast, where we explore the question, why this big idea now? I'm Annice, and today's conversation asks us to look at education and one of the places it's often least visible, behind bars. We're exploring Learning Lives Here, stories of humanizing education and incarcerated spaces. Education has the power to restore dignity and possibility, even in confinement. But too often, access to learning depends on where you are and not who you are. Today, we'll hear from educators, innovators, and system leaders who are redefining what it means to learn, lead, and transform from within. We're honored to welcome today's panelists. Dr. Amanda Klonsky, who is a community researcher and advocate for higher education in incarcerated settings. Dr. Sherry Travers, who is a lead teacher within incarcerated settings, and she's also an advocate in higher education, and her dissertation work is on education in incarcerated settings. And Mr. Angel Pentoya. He's a reentry policy coordinator at the Justice, Equity, and Opportunity Office in the Office of the Lieutenant Governor, Juliana Stratton. Thank you all for joining us, so let's get started. Before we dive in, we always like to start here. We ask each panelist, what's giving you hope right now? And we'll start with Amanda.
Thanks for having me. What's giving me hope right now is the leadership of people who are currently and formerly incarcerated and the way they're organizing inside and outside of prisons to create change. In my current work as a researcher and a writer, I'm constantly in conversation with people who spent years or decades behind bars and are now leading campaigns for parole reform, running college and prison programs, building mutual aid projects, and organizing around access to housing, violence prevention, and reentry. Many of them started that work on the inside, teaching classes on the tiers, forming study groups, helping people prepare their legal motions or college applications, and they've carried that leadership home and are now leading efforts towards social change. I don't teach on the inside right now, but my job is to document those efforts through my research and to elevate the pedagogies that best serve incarcerated students. And of course, as an advocate, to push our institutions and policies to catch up to what directly impacted people are already doing. So the hope for me is very concrete right now. I see the people the criminal legal system tried to discard acting as teachers, strategists, and community leaders, and that really nourishes me and gives me hope.
Thank you. Thank you. Angel, what's giving you hope right now?
I think what's giving me hope, and it's very similar to what Amanda just stated. Yes, I absolutely appreciate and love the fact that those that have been impacted by the system are sort of coming together, making this change. But the flip side to that coin is that there are people in leadership positions out here, both legislators, state agencies, nonprofit organizations, that are recognizing that these men and women have so much to offer, and they're not just being consulted for their ideas; they're being asked to lead agencies, to lead organizations. It's really just a marriage of those that have lived through it, and people out here recognizing and accepting and embracing, and sort of, you know, proving that stigma is false, right? Whatever stigma is on a system impacted person, it's not holding people back from achieving careers and employment.
Thank you. Sherry?
And I'd like to build on what both Amanda and Angel said. Working in incarcerated settings, particularly in Massachusetts, there has been a lot of conversations in the media based on research that the single variable that seems to impact rates of recidivism is education and programming that leads to gainful employment. And so that has been the conversation. And as a result of that, what we have been able to see is that there are more people who are believing in education and in programming to help give access to people to have opportunities to engage in these types of areas. And ultimately, it does lead to lower rates of recidivism. But most importantly, so on a systematic level, the communities are seeing that. But on the individual level, we constantly hear from people who not only talk about the impact that education has on individuals' lives, but that it has an impact on families and communities. So it is a multi generational approach to a systematic problem that ultimately I think we are seeing people on the outside, the external systems, recognizing the impact of this. And we're seeing people who have been impacted by systems on the outside that may have taken away opportunities that they are now getting in this setting. And there is this sort of beautiful interconnectedness of the two systems, and being able to see that brings me a lot of joy.
Wow. Thank you all. I mean, just to weave together what we heard the idea of people who the system has sought to discard actually being able to take their power back and lead those efforts of change. We heard that not only are they being invited for voices, but they're being invited to lead initiatives and sit in these key positions. I think about you, Angel. I think about Willette Beneford here in Illinois. We're just seeing folks say, we don't want to just take your idea. We actually want you to be the leader of that. And we're hearing you say, Sherry, what's giving you hope is this idea that we need to look at both the internal and the external system. So we all need to find value in the importance of allowing people access to education. So this was hot to get us started. So I know if that was just a hope, I cannot wait to dig into the conversation. So I want to begin to pivot us to think about specifically, how do we humanize education in incarcerated spaces? And in particular, what is that experience also for justice impacted young people? So Amanda, I'm going to start with you, and then I'll go to Angel and then to Sherry, each of you with a different question based on your area of expertise. So Amanda, you've worked both with learners in the K-12 space, and then you've also put on the hat for access in higher education. What does humanizing education look like in those spaces? And what impacts have you seen, if any, of that actually happening? So what does humanizing education look like in the K-12 and higher ed space, and what impact have you witnessed firsthand?
When I think about humanizing education in incarcerated spaces, I mean, starting from the premise that people who are locked up are not their charges, they're not their ID numbers, they're thinkers, they're leaders, and they're experts on the systems that most policymakers only read about, right? They're experts on their own lives and their own lived experience. And that's the place where great educators start, right? Knowing their students and understanding what their students know, what they understand, what their previous educational experiences have been like, how they see the world. And in order to really teach someone well, you have to know them in those ways. And so that's the beginning when I think about humanizing education. That's the basis of all good teaching, right? I started this work as a young educator in Nancy B. Jefferson School, which is inside of the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center, more years ago than I hope to admit on this podcast. And in that context, I was co-leading a literacy and arts program in that school. And that work was rooted in the tradition and the pedagogy of the Mississippi Freedom Schools, where literacy was not just seen as the skill of learning to read and write, decipher text, but as the capacity, the learning to think critically, to challenge the conditions of your life, and to participate as a citizen in a democracy. And so in those classrooms, we watched children and adolescents who'd been pushed out of schools over and over again, over minor infractions often, right? They got into a fight, or they got into a conflict with a teacher, or sometimes they were absent for many days at a time because of conditions they couldn't control, right? We're told they couldn't come back after they'd been incarcerated or detained. Those young people who had hugely disrupted histories in school We watched them become strong writers, peer tutors, facilitators for each other's learning, and really some of the strongest teaching in that building came from youth mentoring other young people. I don't teach inside right now. My work is more focused on research and policy, but I'm in relationship with many people, including Angel on this podcast, whose leadership began in those informal classrooms. The person who helped everyone on the unit study, who organized around the conditions inside, who is now running a college and prison program on the outside, or leading a campaign to end solitary confinement, or reshaping reentry policy. So for me, again, humanizing education isn't a soft add on to a harsh system, a punitive system. It should be a way of recognizing and resourcing the intellectual and political leadership and power that already exists among incarcerated people. I think that's probably enough for now.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to resist the urge to want to speak after y'all's talk because this is so good. So I'm going to turn to you, Angel. And since Amanda invited you into the space partially with what she said, drawing on your dual experience as both a learner and an instructor in incarcerated space, as a tutor, as all of the ways you informally held class and formally held class, how do you distinguish between humanizing and patronizing approaches to education? Um, what practices truly restore dignity and agency for students in those places?
So I think of the professors and the teachers, and it doesn't matter what level it was, whether it was GED, whether it was community college or the University of Illinois. I can distinctly remember the professors and teachers that said these are the things you need to do, and and it sort of rubbed everybody the wrong way because you're coming in here. You first of all, you're coming into our space, and I think that's one of the things that's sort of important is that when we start talking about humanizing, usually traditionally students go to the classroom, they go to school, they go to the university. However, in when in prison, we look at every single space within that prison as our home, and yet these professors are coming into our home telling us the things that we need to do, and more importantly that we need to change the way we think, because the way we think, and this is usually, you know, how they phrase it, the way that we think is what got us locked up in the first place, right? So
Mm,
and I'm not sure what their sort of expectation or their intention is behind that. It's almost saying the things that I'm going to give you, the ideas that I'm going to give you, are going to sort of stop you from you know, from this criminal behavior, from this criminal thinking. um so as Amanda said, right off the bat there's this sort of assumption that you are what
mhm,
you've done. So then when I start thinking about who is it that is actually being taught, and I can speak, you know, through all my years of incarceration, it's usually the same group. And it seems like there was a generation of us because of the 1994 crime bill. There was a generation of children essentially that were incarcerated, and we were all sort of tossed in at the same time, right? And even if we're 30 at this point, or we're almost in our 40s, by the time we actually get a chance to get some education, what people need to understand is that you're still sort of addressing those wounded teenagers, right? And the funny thing is,
mhm,
people don't ever think that education can be harmful. But if you're gonna sort of be, and I remember I've used the word patronizing before, because it makes it seem that everything that you know to this point, or the life that you're living at this moment, has doesn't have that much value. And the education we're bestowing upon you, this is what's going to give you value from now
mhm,
on. So when people talk about using our experience and the things that we know and that we've experienced, every single time I've had an opportunity, And to me, it's always been a privilege to help my peers, because we've all come together at some point on the wings and said, ain't nobody coming to save us, right? And that's sort of the mentality. So
Mm-hmm.
when we get one of our own to stand in front of the classroom, we know that one, he's taking he's not only is he going through the same things that we're going through, the sort of daily harassment, the daily sort of abuses, but he's willing to endure all that and then still go and prepare a lesson plan for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, we may be talking about a war that happened in Europe in the 1500s, but I can sort of make it relevant to 20, in the 2000s and the things that are happening now. Whereas oftentimes, professors are like, what's happening now is irrelevant. Just make sure you memorize the facts and you're able to regurgitate them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that a lot of us just aren't comfortable with. We want to make sure that the things that we're learning are meaningful to our lives.
Right.
I hope I answered your question, because I felt like I just went in the circle there.
No, no, you did. You answered the piece about what does it look like to humanize? What does it look like for it to be not patronizing? And then you talked about the impact of having someone in front of you who have had your experiences. Was there any time that you felt like someone came before you and they created a learning environment that was one based in your agency, one based in your dignity?
So what's interesting, one of my favorite professors is Rebecca Ginsburg, who's also the director of the Education Justice Project. Now, it's funny that you ask such a big question, right? Your agency. All she had to do was ask me, so what do you think? What do you mean? What do I think? Like, you're asking me. She's like, yeah. What do you think that? And then after I gave
Mm-hmm.
my opinion, she said, okay, defend it. She never said I was wrong. I might have been completely wrong, but
Right,
she
right.
genuinely cared about the idea that was formulating in my mind, and she asked me to defend it. Just that
Mm-hmm.
simple thing, that simple question of what do you think, that made me feel empowered, like, wow, my opinions matter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, thank you. Shout out to Rebecca if you watched this episode for what you were able to do in honoring Angel's humanity. Oh, Sherry, as someone who's leading online education across, the Department of Corrections, how do you balance just the logistics of like technology, access, all the policies that go into this process with just the human need for connection and learning?
In order to answer that question, I really feel that I need to step back a second and I need to build on something that both Amanda and Angel said. Starting with Angel, Annice, and Amanda, probably the most powerful experience that I have had in my, and I'm not afraid to say it, 28 years in education, both in public and in my current setting. The most powerful advice that I received was from a student who will remain anonymous, who explained that he did not have a problem with education. His problem was that education taught him what to think and not how to think. And so that leads me to my practice, that leads me to my entire belief system, and it's how I can approach exactly the context in which I work. You have to understand the context in which you are working, and we all face very complex problems all the time, and often we go in and we try to respond with our individual self without understanding what impacts that system. So, stepping back, understanding what impacts this incarcerated setting, and what impacts it impacts everybody that is in that system, from the person who opens the door in the morning to the person who is making the greatest decisions throughout the entire day, or people who are feeling that they have no choice. It impacts everybody. So understanding that and helping people to recognize that virtual education is not simply a close and play record player. That's not what it is at all. It is a blended model of education that is centered in humanity. And the task is really figuring out, how do we leverage our technologies, what is possible through technology, to do exactly what everybody says that they want. Everybody says that they want lower rates of recidivism. We seem to know what brings about lower rates of recidivism. And now we have this tool that, again, has to start with an invitation to learn, understanding that different school systems throughout history have caused more damage to young people and ultimately made young people feel that they did not belong in a school setting. So we start with that. And again, recognizing that technology isn't the be all and end all, but it's certainly going to help us to be able to expand our reach and to make things possible. And through technologies, we can help to bring people who can provide very specific training and expertise into settings where there were not, these things were not possible. And with education, always reminding people of the greatest, some of the greatest advice that I received, which was to recognize that you have power and choice in every decision. And when your choices are most difficult, that's when your choices matter most. And helping people to understand the end goal, including the people who make policy. If what we're doing is this is the end goal, how do we get to the end goal? And helping people to recognize that all of the barriers that we put up, both systematically and then we do internally ourselves based on experiences, actually lead us away from our intended goal. And that's how I do it. And I recognize that every challenge has to be recognized. It has to be, the people who are going to lose something have to be honored. Their feelings, their understanding, it has to be honored, or we're never going to get beyond that, and we're never going to be able to move forward. I don't know if I answered the entire question, but that's how I approach it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for sharing your perspectives on humanizing education. And I'm going to circle back a little later in the podcast about what I sometimes feel is an argument for why we should educate is often attached to recidivism or these other sort of norms for control. And I'm wondering, like, how do we get to the place where it's just about people deserve to have access to high quality experiences to improve their lives as they are working their way through this particular part of their journey. And that part of their journey just happens to be, within an incarcerated space. I want us to pivot a little bit, and Sherry, you brought this up slightly about the systemic barriers and equity issues that exist with teaching within incarcerated spaces. And I've had that in my own experience teaching a course in a space that shall remain nameless. And sometimes you go in and there's not enough chairs. It's extremely hot. We aren't able to bring in the adequate resources just to give our students what they deserve. Or sometimes, our correctional officers are bringing our students down late, and so now they've missed, access to instruction. And we're excited to get in to learn, but they've been brought down late. And so there's all sorts of things happening in these spaces where we have a desire to create, a humanizing experience, to design that, yet we're within a system that has some real barriers to doing that. So, Angel, from your previous work with the Illinois Coalition for Higher Education in Prison, and now with reentry at the JEO office, what have you learned about how education can shift identity, purpose, and opportunity for returning citizens? Another big question.
So yesterday I was not yesterday, Friday. Friday I went to Denville Correctional Center, and I took with me the directors of the Department of Juvenile Justice, um, because we sort of want to model their. There's a specific program at Danville that deals with trauma informed care, and we want to sort of bring that to the Department of Juvenile Justice. And one of the participants said, "Normal people matter," and what he was referring to was um, the fact that outside volunteers come in and oftentimes have to drive a couple of hours to get there and spend time with him. And the reason he said it is because there was a particular facilitator that told him, "I need you to understand that you were a good person." And to him, he had been incarcerated 27 years. He said that's the first time anyone has ever said that to me. And he's like, yeah, I know amongst each other we're all good guys, but to have someone from the outside come in and tell me that means something. I think there's way too many people going into facilities just to collect a paycheck, just to expand their resume. But when the right people go in there, they're changing people's lives with one small phrase, right? One small statement, and they're changing people's lives. And then you can sort of scaffold onto that all the good learning that they can bring. And I think that's what I've learned both at Ilchep and with the offices. There are there may be not enough good people that are going into the system. Um, and I think particularly for those at some universities, there are some good people that aren't being allowed to do so because the particular universities just aren't letting them do it. They don't want any association with the carceral system. So I think that's what I've learned. That we just everybody talks about a capacity issue, and I know there's plenty of good people out here. I just think we need more of them to be going into the prison system. Like I don't need you to teach me about philosophy. If you do, that's great. But I just need you to be a good person rather than like the most brilliant person.
Thank you. Thank you, Angel. That ties back to what you were sharing earlier around like how you see people and how you respect them, and just those words of seeing the individual on the other side and honoring their humanity versus this idea of coming in and putting on. So what I feel like I was hearing you say underneath what the tissue under the words was like, we need good people to come in and teach. We don't need just a bunch of people to rush to teach inside incarcerated spaces. We need somebody that's coming in with the right heart posture because that right heart posture changes everything. Okay, so I want to move us into segment three and talk a little bit about reimagining justice through education. All of you all at some point talked about the systemic barriers to creating equity in these spaces. I want us to begin to think about what would it look like to change policy for spaces. So my question for you is: education sometimes stops at the prison door for some people, and if you would allow me to pivot, I'm going to pivot here because it's something that I notice and I would love for you all to comment on, because I think it represents the differentiated experiences of incarcerated individuals and who gets access to education. And I think it's a policy thing that we often don't talk about. In some spaces, only people who have not had any quote unquote infractions or warnings are allowed to have access to educational programming. So we've all seen this in some incarcerated spaces. It's only quote unquote good students. There's sort of a parsing out of who gets access to learning in incarcerated spaces. I would love for you all to talk about what are your thoughts on those types of policies, on how we divide who has a right to have access to education and how that might be presenting an equity issue within incarcerated spaces.
So currently, the Illinois Department of Corrections, they have been pretty fair when it comes to infractions. Let me be very careful how I sort of say that. The infractions that are keeping students out of the school building are any major infractions that happened within that setting. So
Okay.
if there was a fight within that school building, now at that point you just put a lot of people in sort of in danger.
Mm-hmm.
And these aren't they're temporary restrictions, they're temporary bans that can be revisited later on. I think the biggest issue within the Department of Corrections here in Illinois is the distinguishing between those that have shorter sentences and long term sentences. And it is incredibly difficult for those that have long term sentences to get into these programs, or anybody who isn't eligible for school credit, right? There's a certain segment that's going to get preferential treatment. They'll get the first class, or they might even get two classes, where someone who doesn't receive those credits may be at the bottom of the list. Um, but where it gets interesting is that, and not a lot of people understand this, when it comes to higher education, now we're talking about universities, and there's about 12 of them currently in IDOC. They get to set their own criteria. So that's sort of the great thing. That now is the difference between the short timers and the long timers are really those for those getting into education with the adult basic education and GED. And you're right, that's policy because that's all legislated. And until that changes, that's how it will always be. People with longer term sentences will always get bumped down, and those with shorter sentences will always take their place. However, when you get to higher education, it's those universities that they get to determine what students they bring in.
Thank you for sharing that, for that distinction. Amanda?
Can you repeat the question that you're hoping we'll respond to?
Yes, I was interested in, and I'm doing a slight pivot, beyond um, this general idea of reimagining justice and education. I'm curious about your thoughts on policies that often exist in incarcerated settings about who gets access to education, and how that might be presenting an equity, issue. So Angel talked about short term versus long term, and then he talked about the fact that universities then set their own criteria. So some of it is even outside of the hands of that actual institution. So I'm just trying to learn a little bit more about how some of those policies may, in fact, create equity issues to being able to access education.
So I think there's nobody who understands the limitations and the challenges in Illinois around higher ed better than Angel. He's really the person we all look to for leadership on this issue. And I think his points are correct. But I will just add one, which is about young people, which is to say, one of the most perverse policy issues I've dealt with as an educator is with young people in detention in particular, and emerging from the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice, who are routinely pushed out of school upon return to their communities, because there is really no incentive for public schools to take those children back, right? schools that are routinely punished for or looked at punitively if their test scores drop, for example, don't have any incentive to take back children who probably won't score very well, right? Probably need resources that far surpass what the school may have available in terms of emotional support, behavioral support, and to catch up in school academically, right? Who are way off track to graduation. If a school is being judged on a metric, for example, that based on their graduation rate, and you have a child who's way off track to graduate 8th grade or high school on time, it's illegal, of course, under what the federal law still remains, right? It's still illegal to discriminate against or push a kid out of school in their area school if on the basis of having been incarcerated. They have to enroll them. But we know, educators know in practice, right? And one of the most frustrating things I saw routinely as an educator in the detention center and in the Cook County Jail was people coming back, young people coming back who had just said goodbye to me last Wednesday. Goodbye, Miss Amanda. I'm getting discharged. And they're back 2 weeks later. What happened? Well, I tried to re-enroll in school. They told me I couldn't come back, and then I got violated because I wasn't in school. And Cook County has changed that practice, by the way, but that you can't be violated for this. But it still creates a vacuum in a young person's life where they don't have the social structure, the supportive care of a school because they're not in school when they're supposed to be. And so, of course, it's illegal, but there's no class action lawsuit coming to defend the most vulnerable kids whose rights are being denied. And there's also no great influx of resources coming to schools in the communities that have the biggest need, that have the largest number of youth who've been detained or incarcerated and who really need those extra supports, can't just do it with what they have, right? And so I think it's important to remember that on the very front end, right, children as young as 12 years old, right, going into these systems often lose access to the supportive structure of school. And in this moment, in particular, when SNAP benefits have been cut and people are in peril losing access to food, I just want to also name that we're not exclusively talking about reading and writing and math and social studies and access to high school graduation and all of those important rights. We're also talking about meals, right? We're also talking about access to food. Kids who may only eat if they're in detention or in school, who are not in school. And so I think we have to think about school and access to education both on the inside and the outside as the same thing, right? It's not a special privilege to go to school when you're detained or incarcerated. It's not a thing that only some special people who are in for the right amount of time should get access to, right? It's also not a special privilege to go to school on the outside. And so when we insist on equity, when we talk about access, we have to talk about the whole thing, right? And when you talk about why I love the fact that you talked about humanizing education as the subject of this podcast is because when you see people as human beings rather than inmates or offenders or whatever horrible language and labels these systems slap on people, when you see people as human beings and you start with the assumption that all people are fundamentally capable of learning and growth and transformation, then you cannot see these as separate issues, right? They become the same issue. Can you, if you're an adult learner and you go to college on the inside somehow, then those credits have to transfer when you get out, right? And in the same way, if you're going to 5th grade for 6 months in the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center, you should be able to finish 5th grade when you get out of juvenile detention. So I'll get off my soapbox.
Thank you for sharing this idea of it being an entire system. Wow, what would that look like if we actually saw education as a system that has access to everyone, regardless of the container in which you learn? So Sherry, I want to pull you in to start to get us to answer this question, which Angel and Amanda has started. How I'm sorry, what partnerships or policy changes would allow education to play a bigger role in justice reform? So I'm just zooming us out right now. When we think about this idea of education, what partnerships, so think about organizations, things you've seen, or policy changes would allow education to play a bigger role in justice reform? Amanda kind of got us started there with how we look at education, but what do you think would be a game changer?
So I have a couple big ideas that I would
Let's
like
just
to
do one.
so I want to challenge the world in thinking about this, because we are taught what Amanda said is we have people who are going back into carceral settings to get access right now to education and food. So if we think about this as an economic problem, and because that's what the world responds to, an economic problem. The price of incarceration is so much greater per person than teachers and education programs. And the long term benefits of education on recidivism, because we're helping people to gain access to opportunities, is a critical factor that people have to look at. So we have to start having the right conversations with people, using the right terminology so that people understand what this means. If we are not doing it out of our moral sense, then let's do it out of our economic sense and look at it from an economic perspective, because it does not make sense. Many of our systems are built by names that appear to be helping people, but they're not. They're quick fixes that build systems of dependence and oppression. And then we ask big questions about these systems of oppression, and we blame individual people for being part of these systems, not recognizing what systems produce themselves. So that's my suggestion. If we're looking at policy, let's look at the right policies that address the economic issue, which is having systems that become educational systems for children and adults who were shut out of the public ones for whatever reasons. And I won't go into it very much, but then let's start to look at what Angel talked about, people who, when they are having some kind of conflict, that no longer have access to education. Let's look at the causes of that, because what we know that when people don't feel like they have any control whatsoever, that's when you start to see people act out. It's not when people are feeling good, not when people are feeling confident and competent. It's the opposite.
Thank you, Sherry. Angel, did you want to comment at all on any partnerships or policy changes that would allow education to play a bigger role in justice reform?
So one of the things I've been seeing, as I mentioned, I think we have like 12 higher educational partners in Illinois, and every single one of them isn't just concerned with delivering instruction. Every single one of them want to talk about reentry. They want to talk about policies. They want to talk about administrative directives. Um, and oftentimes I kind of have to remind them that while I certainly appreciate their advocacy, if they want to continue to sort of have this relationship with the Department of Corrections, they can't be as revolutionary as they want to be. Do you know what I mean? There are some educators who I'll not name, who I absolutely love and are great friends of mine, but they're ready to burn the whole thing down. And then I have to remind them that if they get themselves into trouble, the people that are going to suffer the most are the students who now lose a professor or an entire program. Um, so I definitely appreciate that. At least in Illinois, there are those, you know, directors and professors that are not just comfortable with teaching. They're looking at currently right now. It was a professor who brought to our attention that there's a student that's going through some medical problems. And when we start talking about justice reform, we're not just talking about like sentencing laws, and everybody just assumes that it's these big sort of legislative, changes. When we're talking about changing the justice system, it's about changing the small things as well as the big
Mm-hmm.
things that affect that are unjust within the system. Someone not getting proper adequate health care, that's unjust, right?
Right.
Someone not having contact with their family members because they've been put on restriction for 2-3 years at a time, that's unjust, right? And again, we have those professor, that aren't comfortable with the way things are and are constantly trying to change things. Where it gets interesting is that their university presidents want nothing to do with that revolution and are just comfortable with just the way things are. Um, but I think we need to really understand that universities and colleges are a business. They are, and if we hurt the business, then they have no problem getting rid of the program. So it's a very sort of interesting balance in how do we, be these justice warriors, and how do we be these educators, and making sure that we're still sort of able to continue to give this instruction.
Go ahead and lay the truth on us, Angel. Tell us the truth. Amanda, did you? Thank you to both you and Sherry. Amanda, did you have any comments?
I think I've commented on this, but if I may, I wanted to ask Angel, do you want to comment on funding access as an essential piece of this puzzle? Higher education has to be funded, right, inside. And incarcerated students have to have access to funding in order to create an incentive and a pathway for higher education programs to come into prisons and to pay for courses to be offered there. So I just want to name that because we have been in a kind of protracted struggle to defend the small advances that have been made in the last decade to expand, for example, access to Pell funding for incarcerated students. And so we want to make sure that there's no backing off of that opportunity under the current conditions and the current administration.
And I guess if we're truth telling, the things that are happening on the federal level are giving people in leadership sort of an excuse as to why they can't fund this, because now we got to make sure that we fund other essential services. However, what was the excuse prior to this administration, right? It's unfortunate that most states, and this one included, isn't sort of taking the charge and making sure that these programs are funded. There's a lot of money going into the Department of Corrections. By my last sort of calculation, it's $2 billion. $2 billion to incarcerate folks in Illinois. And you're telling me you can't carve out a small piece to make sure that we can expand education to all 27 adult facilities and the 5 juvenile facilities. Um, and the programs that exist now have been doing it through funders. And the interesting thing about philanthropy is they sort of set the metric, and they want to know, well, how does this help with recidivism? Right? Because that's really why we even talk about recidivism, is because someone who's got money wants to know, what am I going to get for this money? And this is what they want, right? They sort of set the metric for how things are going to be measured, how success is measured. And there's a whole lot of things and a whole lot of thinking that needs to be changed there.
Mm-hmm.
It again connects to this essential idea that you've raised, Annice, which is that idea about humanization. What does it mean to humanize? People are already humans before educators showed up in a prison to give them an opportunity to participate in a class, right? But in this process of participating as teachers and educators and as classmates and students and scholars, we become more human, right? This is an idea, a pedagogical idea first put forth to us by Paulo Freire, right? The pedagogical theorist who said this is a process of critical consciousness, right? Of humanization, where we all, through the process of teaching and learning, become more fundamentally human. And when you can't accept as a premise the idea that people in prison are human beings who fundamentally deserve the right to grow and change, transform themselves, and learn, then you can't get past this idea of recidivism as the only metric that matters. The only reason someone should have access to education is if we can prove that it reduces crime. But of course, when I went to my doctoral program with Dr. Fisher, at the front door of going to Harvard, nobody said, do you deserve the right to go to college? Do you deserve this fundamentally? Have we decided, or will it prevent you from doing something harmful in the future? Right? As we all know, well, maybe we don't all know, people who've gone to college. There are plenty of people who've gone to college, or certainly who've gone to Harvard, who've gone on to do some pretty heinous things, right? So when did that become the only criteria on which we determine that someone has value, someone has essential value and deserves to have the right to read and write or access education? It's a problematic idea, but I think through education we learn, right, ourselves as educators to be more human and to be more than that, and it changes the metric on which we make these kinds of policy decisions when we change ourselves.
Thank you all for helping us to reimagine what justice can look like through education, especially now at a time when everything around us is telling us not to keep dreaming and not to keep believing in what's possible. We have to keep working towards what is possible. And our resolve, to me, has to just keep growing, especially right now in our current circumstances in the world and the attack on our own humanity. So, what we heard today reminds us that learning isn't a privilege, it's actually a lifeline, no matter where you are. And when we bring education into spaces of confinement, we're not just teaching content, we're actually restoring all of our humanity, all of our humanity. And that the big idea here isn't just access. I think Amanda, Angel, and Sherry have talked extensively. It's not just about access. It's about a belief that every learner deserves the right to education, a chance to rewrite their story, a chance to decide what their next pathway will be. And so we always end with this question: what hope are you giving to the people? And we will start with Sherry, we will go to Amanda, and we will end with Angel.
I want everyone to know that they belong in education as much as anyone else. Education doesn't belong to a few people, it belongs to everyone. And anyone that ever gave someone that message that they didn't belong was afraid. And that should not be the determining factor. So that is what leads me forward, making sure that people know that they belong in education, and that through education, we create our own narratives, and we're not going to let anyone decide what our thinking is going to be, that we own that as individuals.
Thank you, Sherry. Amanda?
So I want to tell a little story. Years ago, two young people I taught in the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center were put on what was then called 36-hour, which was a heinous practice that has thankfully been gotten rid of there, when a kid in the detention center was held in their room as a form of punishment for 36 hours. And right, this was totally inhumane and developmentally inappropriate form of punishment. But these two young people, a boy and a girl, had never met because the detention center is gender segregated. And in spite of that, they discovered that if one of them laid on the floor of their room with her ear pressed to the tile, and the boy stood on his bed and spoke through the vent, they could hear each other from their different units. And so in a place that was defined by isolation and loneliness, these two young people created their own learning community, and they spent hours reading a Walter Dean Myers novel aloud to each other, one voice through the vent and one ear to the floor, because they refused to let the system take away their connection, their curiosity, and their humanity. It was a book that I had given them in my classroom. And so that kind of self-determination is what I carry with me now in my research and my writing. When I see young people and adults who have survived these systems working as educators, building organizations, leading campaigns, teaching inside and outside, and creating networks of care that institutions should have provided but didn't. And so the hope I'm offering is not abstract. It's rooted in the fact that people in this system, the people the system have tried to silence, have always found ways to learn, to love, to lead, and to organize. And my belief is that when we as educators follow their insight and their resources, their resourcefulness in their leadership, we can build schools and policies and institutions worthy of their brilliance and resilience.
Thank you. Angel, take us home.
I think in 2025, I visited 7 institutions. 5 of them were places where I was formerly incarcerated at. Every single time I went in there, it was like ripping up old scars, right? Ripping them open. And every single time I told the men who I spoke to, like, this is incredibly difficult, but I will continue to come in here until you get the things that you need. I said, I'm not by myself. There are many others who do the same sort of work. And I remember visiting Logan Correctional Center, which is a women's facility. And I went in a suit because I was doing official business. And one of they were housed in segregation, and they were all together in a bullpen. And I told them, I know exactly what it feels like to be in your position. And right away, they're like, how could you possibly know what we feel like? And then I explained to them, I've been in seg for years when I was incarcerated. And one of them turns to the other and says, man, look at him. If he can do it, we can do it. And the same thing has happened in other institutions with the men, where, like, we know we're going to be okay because we see what you're doing, and we know we're going to be okay. We know we're going to be okay. So not only do they know they're going to be okay when they come home, because they see that education can sort of, there's a reward after it, right? There's an expectation that things are going to be better because of the education that we got. And then there's also the hope that while they're still in there, they have myself and again, several others who are still looking after them, whether they know it or not, still trying to make changes, in sentencing policy so that some of them can come home sooner, trying to make reentry a smoother transition for them. So I think the hope is no one's done fighting, regardless of what's happening, regardless of how much stuff we have on our plate. We're still fighting for our brothers and sisters on the inside.
Thank you to our panelists, Dr. Amanda Klonsky, Angel Pentoya, and Dr. Sherry Travers, for taking time out of your day to engage in this really important conversation. And I'm hoping that it's going to leave whoever listens to this podcast with the words that you said, Mr. Angel, which was that we don't stop fighting for our brothers and sisters on the inside. That someone will hear what you all heard today and imagine that their voice could be used for a brother or a sister on the inside of our collective humanity. So thank you to the listeners for being a part of Big Ideas That Matter. Until next time, we want you to keep asking, why this big idea now? Have a great day, folks.